When people whisper about an approaching crisis, I'm reminded of something simple. Markets don't ring a bell before they break. They shift quietly like a faint draft of wind that senses the storm long before the sky turns black. And when I say, be careful with certain banks, I'm not predicting the future. I'm shining a small flashlight into the corners where shadows tend to grow. I've watched investors lose fortunes simply because they never understood what's inside a bank's balance sheet. When growth slows, when credit risks pile up, when a bank depends on fragile funding just to stay afloat, those aren't headlines, those are warnings. If you're keeping your savings in institutions where liquidity problems aren't a matter of if but when, then you owe it to yourself to pause and ask, is this truly a safe harbor? A bank is trustworthy only until the moment it isn't, and stress never asks for permission before it arrives. That's why I say there are three categories of banks a prudent person should exit before the pressure hits. And if you'll allow me, I'll explain why, along with one small habit that saved me billions back when billions were just numbers in someone else's newspaper. Most people look at a bank the way they look at a familiar storefront. The logo feels safe. The lobby feels polished. The employees smile. And the digital app works, so everything must be fine. But a bank's real story is written in the invisible places: the duration of its assets, the stability of its deposits, the discipline of its lending, and the honesty of its risk models. I learned that lesson in the late 1980s when I watched a well-known regional bank collapse seemingly overnight. On the surface, it looked prosperous. Behind the curtain, it had been stretching short-term deposits to fund long-term, low-yield loans, an act that works beautifully until the day depositors want their money back. And that's the first type of bank you need to run from, the one that mismatches time. If a bank relies on unstable, fast-moving deposits to carry slow-moving assets, it's living on borrowed time. The second type is even more dangerous because its weakness hides inside optimism. These are banks that convince themselves that credit cycles don't really apply to them. They lend aggressively in good times, loosen standards to chase market share, and assume that the world will stay sunny just because the corner office hopes it will. When the downturn hits, they discover too late that hope doesn't cover losses. The third type is the one that pretends complexity is strength. These banks build towers of derivatives, off-balance sheet vehicles, exotic funding structures, and leverage ratios that only make sense on paper. They reassure investors with thick reports and elegant graphs, but complexity is just another word for fragility. I've said for decades that you should never own a business you can't understand, and I'll add this: you should never trust a bank whose balance sheet requires a PAAHDAAEDDDHEHE to decode. Years ago, I made a habit that saved me more times than I can count. I would pick up a bank's annual report, open to the balance sheet, and ask myself one question: could this institution survive a storm? If the answer wasn't an immediate, unforced yes, I never put a dollar near it. That small discipline, repeated consistently, built more safety for me than any clever trade or timely prediction ever could. And the irony is, the world rarely sees the catastrophe you avoid because avoiding it means it never arrives for you in the first place. Investors don't get applause for the disasters they sidestep, but those are the moments that keep your future intact. And right now, when liquidity shifts, when commercial real estate wobbles, when rates stay higher than comfortable, you can feel the early tremors beneath the surface. The question isn't whether a crisis will come someday. The question is whether you're still standing where the wave will hit. When I tell people to get out of certain banks before the crisis, I'm not trying to scare them. I'm trying to remind them of something they often forget. A bank is only as strong as the assumptions it makes about the world. And most banks, whether they admit it or not, build their foundations on optimism, not resilience. I learned that lesson decades ago when I watched a seemingly solid institution fall apart in less than 48 hours. It wasn't because of fraud or scandal, it was because the bank had quietly built its business on short-term money, long-term loans, and the belief that depositors would never all knock on the door at the same time. But money doesn't read reports or promises. Money moves where it feels safest, and when fear spreads even a little, it moves fast. That's why I always tell people, the danger in banking isn't what you see on the surface. The danger is what the surface is hiding. The first type of bank you should flee is the one dependent on unstable deposits funding that can vanish in a heartbeat, leaving the institution scrambling for liquidity it never truly had. The second type is the bank that confuses rising markets with good judgment. These banks lend aggressively in good times, believing the sunshine will last forever. And they convince themselves that low defaults are the result of their brilliance, not simply the result of a forgiving economic tide. When the tide goes out, as it always does, their balance sheets start revealing truths they hoped would never be tested. And the third type is the bank that hides behind complexity, beautiful charts, sophisticated risk models, layers of derivatives, and structures that not even the board fully understands. Complexity is the enemy of transparency, and transparency is the foundation of trust. If a bank cannot explain how it makes money in one sentence, you shouldn't trust it with a single dollar. I've spent my life avoiding trouble not because I'm smarter than others, but because I'm more patient, more skeptical, and far more willing to admit that risk doesn't care about your confidence. I remember sitting with Charlie late one evening as we went through a bank's filings in silence. After 10 minutes, he closed the report, leaned back, and said, "If it takes this much work to understand what's going on, you don't want to know what's going on." And he was right. Most collapses don't happen because people didn't have the tools to see them coming. They happen because people refused to look deeply enough. They were distracted by dividends, by brand names, by reassuring slogans, by the illusion of stability. But the numbers always tell the truth, they just whisper it quietly, long before the shouting begins. Right now, we're entering a period where those whispers are getting louder. Commercial real estate is under pressure. Interest rates remain higher than comfortable. Regional banks are carrying loans that may not age well, and depositors are more mobile than ever in history. One click on a phone can drain billions in minutes. This isn't fear-mongering. This is structural reality. And if there's one thing I've learned across every crisis from savings and loans to the Great Recession, it's this: you don't have to predict the storm to avoid standing in the middle of it. All you have to do is step aside early, quietly, and intentionally. That's why now, before the pressure builds, before the headlines intensify, before the first domino falls publicly, I want you to understand exactly why these three categories of banks are the ones you should exit before the crisis, not after. Because once a bank is in the news, once the lines form outside the branches, once regulators step in, your optionality is already gone. People often assume that a banking crisis appears suddenly, as if one morning everything is fine and by evening the world is on fire. But that's not how it works. A crisis is a slow leak disguised as normalcy, small pressures accumulating quietly until the structure can no longer bear the weight. And the irony is that the public rarely notices the early signs because they're looking at the wrong indicators. They're watching stock prices instead of deposit volatility, dividend announcements instead of loan quality, earnings calls instead of liquidity buffers. I've seen banks that looked perfectly healthy on a chart but were already bleeding from the inside. Years ago, I watched one particular institution steadily grow its loan book by promising customers lightning-fast approvals and generous terms. Investors loved it. Analysts praised it. The stock soared. But I had a habit, one that kept me out of more disasters than I can count, of ignoring the applause and studying the foundation. And the foundation was cracking: rising loan concentrations, deteriorating underwriting standards, a growing percentage of borrowers with fragile cash flow, and a dependence on short-term wholesale funding. It didn't take a crystal ball to see what was coming. It only took paying attention. Yet most investors stayed in until the bitter end because they didn't want to believe a seemingly strong bank could collapse. That reluctance, the desire to avoid discomfort, is what destroys wealth. Meanwhile, the people who quietly exit early, long before the panic, are often called paranoid, until the moment they're called smart. And that's exactly why I want you to understand how this next phase of pressure unfolds. The cracks always start in the same places: mismatched maturities, concentrated risk, and complexity masquerading as innovation. A bank that funds long-term assets with short-term deposits is playing a game that works beautifully until the music stops. A bank that lends aggressively during boom times is building a balance sheet full of loans that only make sense if the boom never ends. And a bank that constructs elaborate financial structures to chase yield is essentially building a tower on wets, and one shift in the economic tide, and the entire thing slides. I remember Charlie saying something that stuck with me for life: "You don't get in trouble because you didn't know enough. You get in trouble because you thought you knew more than you did." That's why the most dangerous banks are often the most confident ones. They believe their risk models are superior, their teams are brilliant, and their strategies are unbreakable. But markets don't reward confidence, they expose it. And right now, conditions are aligning in a way that will test every weak assumption: rising defaults in commercial real estate, borrowers rolling over debt at higher rates, shrinking deposits as savers chase yield elsewhere, and regulators demanding stronger capital buffers. This isn't a doomsday scenario. It's simply the math of the moment. And math, unlike hope, doesn't negotiate. That's why I'm telling you this before the headlines shift, before social media starts amplifying panic, before bank CEOs begin saying the classic line, "We have plenty of liquidity," the very sentence that usually precedes the opposite. The people who protect their wealth are never the ones reacting in real time. They're the ones who understood the landscape while everyone else was distracted. And right now, if you hold your money in any of those three categories of banks: unstable funding, aggressive lending, or hidden complexity, then you are standing on a fault line. And the ground has already begun to tremble beneath your feet. If you've ever watched a bank fail from the inside, you'd understand why I push people to act early, not heroically late. A failing bank doesn't implode in a dramatic Hollywood moment. It suffocates gradually. First, the executives start speaking in rehearsed phrases instead of honest sentences. They reassure investors with numbers that are technically correct but strategically meaningless. They emphasize strong capital ratios while quietly borrowing liquidity from every emergency window they can find. They talk about short-term headwinds even as their loan portfolio rots from the bottom up. And all the while, depositors begin to drift away, not in a stampede, but in a quiet, steady migration that everyone inside the building feels but no one wants to acknowledge. People think a bank run begins with panic, but more often it begins with discomfort. A business owner moves part of his cash to a safer institution just in case. A family shifts their savings because the advertising feels too optimistic. A CFO withdraws funds because the bank's last quarterly report had too many footnotes. I've seen banks where the run began months before anyone in the public noticed. By the time the story hits the news, the real damage is already done. And this slow motion deterioration is exactly why I tell people to exit risky banks before the crisis, not during, not after. Because when the system is under pressure, speed becomes the most valuable commodity, and speed is the one thing the average depositor doesn't have. Meanwhile, the executives who built the mess always seem shocked, yet the signs were there all along. Extreme loan growth, over-concentrated exposure to commercial real estate, unrealistic valuations on collateral that only made sense when interest rates were near zero, funding structures that relied on deposits from customers who had no real relationship with the bank and would vanish the moment yields rose elsewhere. And while all this unfolds, the bank's internal culture often accelerates the decline, aggressive targets, pressure to maintain growth, incentives that reward risk taking over prudence, and leadership too proud to admit that simple banking, borrowing responsibly, lending carefully, managing risks conservatively will always outperform financial engineering. Charlie and I used to say, you don't find out who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. But there's something most people overlook. You can often see the swimmers long before the tide recedes if you're willing to look closely. And right now, the tide is pulling back faster than many banks can adjust. Higher interest rates are squeezing net interest margins. Commercial real estate loans, especially office space, are facing refinancing cliffs that some borrowers simply cannot climb. Defaults may not be catastrophic yet, but that's exactly how early stages look. It's a quiet softening, not a collapse. And this quiet phase is the moment of opportunity, not for profit, but for protection. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They don't wait for warnings on television. They watch liquidity, they track deposit flows, they analyze loan books, they ask simple but powerful questions. Can this bank withstand stress? Can it survive a sudden withdrawal shock? Does its leadership understand risk or merely explain it? And if the answer isn't convincing, they don't debate, they move. That's what I want for you. Not fear, not panic, but clarity. The clarity to step aside before the storm makes the decision for you. When people ask me how to know whether their bank is heading toward trouble, they expect a complicated formula or a sophisticated model. But the truth has always been far simpler. A healthy bank behaves like a cautious adult, and a troubled bank behaves like a teenager trying to impress someone. A cautious bank keeps more liquidity than it needs, holds loans it actually understands, and avoids fads even when those fads are profitable. A reckless bank stretches for yield, expands faster than its risk controls can keep up, and convinces itself that past stability guarantees future safety. And the moment a bank begins convincing itself of that, it's already drifting into danger. I've watched this cycle for more than half a century, and it rarely fails. First, a bank experiences a few years of easy growth. Depositors pour in. Real estate is booming. Money is cheap. Executives start believing they've unlocked a secret strategy when in reality the wind is simply at their backs. Then, when interest rates rise or markets tighten, the bank discovers that its success was built on conditions that no longer exist. Suddenly, the loans that looked brilliant 2 years ago look fragile. Borrowers struggle. Office buildings sit half empty. Developers miss deadlines. And as the risks grow more visible, the bank begins doing what every insecure institution does. It talks louder. You'll hear phrases like strong liquidity position, robust capital planning, disciplined underwriting, and exceptional asset quality. I have never seen a truly strong bank use those phrases. The strongest institutions speak plainly because they have nothing to hide. They do not rely on jargon to sell confidence. Their balance sheet speaks for them. Meanwhile, inside the troubled bank, the employees feel the tension before anyone else. Lending officers notice that more loans are being flagged for review. Risk managers quietly push back against decisions they once approved. Executives start holding longer meetings, searching for ways to plug gaps without alarming analysts. And in the boardroom, behind polished tables and polished smiles, someone always says the most dangerous sentence in finance: everything will be fine once the market stabilizes. But markets do not stabilize because you need them to. They stabilize when reality allows them to. By the time a bank is hoping for stability, it has already lost control of the narrative. And here's what most depositors don't understand. Once confidence begins to erode, even slightly, the clock starts ticking. Banks do not fail because they run out of money. They fail because they run out of trust. Trust is the oxygen of banking. Lose it, even for a moment, and the institution begins suffocating. I've seen banks with billions in assets collapse in days simply because depositors sensed uncertainty. I've also seen banks with modest resources survive storms because their customers believed in them. And that is why I tell you, the moment you feel the slightest discomfort with your bank, whether it's from their earnings report, their rapid expansion, or the tone of their leadership, you must act before the crowd does. Not because panic is wise, but because prudence is. The people who protect their wealth never wait for confirmation. They move when the evidence is still quiet. Once the headlines begin, once politicians make statements, once the CEO appears on television assuring everyone that things are stable, it is already too late for the average depositor. The exits get crowded, the process slows, and your choices shrink. I want you to choose while you still have choices, because what's coming is not chaos or collapse, it's pressure. Pressure that will expose weak banks and reward strong ones. But pressure does not discriminate. It simply reveals what was always there. If you want to understand why I keep warning people about these vulnerable banks, you have to understand one timeless truth about financial storms: they do not break systems, they reveal them. Crises do not invent weakness. They expose the weakness that leadership tried to paint over. And when exposure happens, it does so with a speed that shocks anyone who relied on hope instead of preparation. Years ago, during a period of intense market stress, I received a call from an investor who held a significant amount of capital in a regional bank he believed was invincible. The institution had a sterling reputation, a charismatic CEO, and glowing analyst reports. But beneath all that polish, it had built its balance sheet on loans that only performed in a perfect world, and the world had just shifted. I told him, if you need reassurance from me, you are already too close to the edge. That same week, the bank announced losses that wiped out a decade of profits. Within days, depositors lined up. Within weeks, regulators stepped in. That is the reality of banking. Stability is slow, but collapse is instantaneous. And right now, in today's environment, three forces are converging in a way that will test every institution in the country. The first force is the most obvious: higher interest rates. People underestimate how deeply rising rates cut into a bank's machinery. They squeeze profitability, pressure borrowers, reduce asset values, and force institutions to recognize losses they had comfortably ignored for years. The second force is the shrinking value of commercial real estate, especially office buildings. Remote work reshaped demand in a way lenders were not prepared for, and now towers once considered prime collateral are becoming liabilities. Many loans will need refinancing at higher rates with lower valuations. Some borrowers will walk away. Others will renegotiate. But every one of those outcomes chips away at the bank's balance sheet. And the third force is liquidity migration. Depositors today can move funds with a swipe, and they chase yield more aggressively than any generation before them. A bank that relied on the inertia of its customers is learning a painful lesson. Loyalty is not a business model. When these three forces combine margin compression, asset deterioration, and depositor mobility, you get a pressure cooker. And it is inside that cooker that the three dangerous types of banks I described earlier begin to crack. The mismatched bank sees funding evaporate faster than it can rebuild. The aggressive lender sees its portfolio deteriorate faster than provisions can be raised. And the complexity-driven bank discovers that none of its models account for the speed of modern fear. But here is the part most people miss. Banks do not fail because their numbers are bad. They fail because their assumptions were wrong. Assumptions about how fast depositors move. Assumptions about how slowly real estate values decline. Assumptions about how forgiving markets will be. I have never once seen a bank destroyed by facts. It is always destroyed by the moment the facts finally overpower the story. And in every crisis, in every cycle, in every era of financial stress, one simple principle decides who survives. Those who prepared early thrive quietly, and those who waited loudly disappear publicly. I want you to be among the people who move early, who recognize the signs before the crowd, who refuse to tie their financial future to institutions that treated risk like a marketing slogan. Because what is coming next is not the end of the system. It is the sorting of it. Strong banks will endure. Weak ones will not. But as a depositor, as an investor, as a steward of your own capital, the time to choose where you stand is before the dust rises, not after. In the end, protecting yourself in a shifting financial landscape is not about predicting the next headline. It is about understanding the quiet patterns that repeat across generations. Every crisis I have lived through, every bubble, every collapse, every moment of panic followed the same human script: complacency in good times, denial in early warnings, and disbelief in the face of inevitability. The people who lost the most were rarely the poorest or the least educated. They were the ones who trusted appearances instead of fundamentals. And banks, more than any other institution, are built on appearances. Tall buildings, elegant branches, glossy statements, confident leaders, none of these guarantee safety. Safety is built in the hard decisions: the capital a bank refuses to distribute, the loans it declines to issue, the risks it decides not to take even when everyone else is celebrating. And that is why I have spent this entire message urging you to exit the three dangerous categories of banks before the pressure becomes visible. Not because disaster is certain, but because prudence is profitable long before panic is. Wealth is not built by reacting to storms. It is built by positioning yourself where storms cannot reach you. And today, with interest rates reshaping the economy, commercial real estate under strain, and depositors moving faster than ever in history, the landscape is shifting in ways that will reward the prepared and punish the hopeful. If you want to safeguard your future, start with a simple question: is my bank prepared for a world that no longer behaves the way it used to? If the answer is uncertain, then your path is not. Move intentionally, move before the crowd, move while movement is still your choice. I have learned more from the crises I avoided than from the gains I achieved. And if there is one final piece of advice I would leave you with, it is this: your financial future is too important to outsource to optimism. Build your safety deliberately. Step away from the institutions built on fragile assumptions and commit to understanding the forces shaping the world around you. The era ahead will challenge the unprepared, but it will reward those who act with clarity, skepticism, and discipline. And if you found value in this message, if it helped you see the landscape a little more clearly, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video.